They say a house remembers its master, but when I returned, mine looked at me with stranger's eyes. The door creaked, not in welcome, but in warning. Every step I took echoed like a question. Who are you to come back? When I left, the hospital swallowed me whole. Machines whispered false prophecies in sterile light, and even the nurses looked at me like a man already gone. My daughter stood at my bedside. Once, and I believed her tears. But tears are a kind of weapon, aren't they? They make you lower your guard so betrayal can enter softly. I was gone for 38 days, enough time apparently to erase me. When I came home, my chair was missing, my books gone, my coat, the one she gave me one winter, gone too. In their place, silence, the kind that hums when guilt has settled into the walls. It wasn't just things she threw away, it was memory, it was fatherhood, it was the proof that I had ever mattered. But the universe keeps its receipts, and when something sacred is discarded, it does not die, it waits. Every item she threw out had a piece of me bound to it, and when I realized that, I didn't mourn. I listened. You can hear the past if you're quiet enough. It whispers from dust, from hinges, from the breath of the wind that sneaks through locked windows. It said, she believed you would not return. It said, she buried you while you still breathed. And I answered softly, then let her learn what resurrection looks like. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor where my chair used to be, and as the moonlight touched the empty shelves, I felt something ancient awaken inside me. Not hatred, not grief, but design, because vengeance, when it's pure, isn't rage, it's order restored, and order always begins with silence. The house kept its secrets, but the silence inside it was different now. Not empty, but charged, like the hush that falls over a battlefield before the surgeon lays down his instruments. I let the quiet sit with me, learned its cadence. The tick of a clock that marked debts, the soft whisper where curtains once hid portraits, the minute settling of a floor that had carried generations. In that stillness, I stopped being a wounded man and began to become an architect of consequence. I wrapped my breath around each memory they'd tried to erase and catalogued them without haste. The necklace I had promised, the mahogany desk my grandfather carved, the coffee cup with chipped glaze from a marriage that had outlived its promise. Each object was a note on a map of who I had been, and by tracing that map I found the lines where I could respond without cruelty and without noise. I did not want their blood, I wanted the calibration of truth. Revenge, I decided, was an economic verb, to restore value where it had been stolen, to unmask intent with documents and witnesses in the slow, unarguable language of law. So I listened for allies in the margins, a notary who moved like a metronome, a neighbor whose politeness could be summoned as testimony, a lawyer with the patience of a winter river. I rehearsed nothing in words. I rehearsed silence, the kind that keeps a man patient while others reveal themselves. At night I walked the rooms they had hollowed out and let each missing thing speak in its absence. The pendant, that small promise of velvet and filigree, glinted in memory and taught me fidelity to details. The empty bookshelf taught me chronology. You cannot erase a life without leaving fingerprints in the blank spaces. I learned to separate fury from strategy. Fury is an unsteady blade, strategy a compass. My heart, still tender from the incision, reminded me that haste would kill the plan as surely as any impulsive strike. So I built contingency like a mason lays stone, careful, exact, refusing shortcuts. Papers were gathered not to punish but to prove. Ledgers, appointment logs, a trail that would show intent instead of accident. I called no one to witness my resolve Instead, I called people who did not flinch at inconvenient truths. Each phone number placed into my pocket felt like a stitch in a new garment of autonomy. This was not the time for spectacle. The true work happens in patient preparation, in the cold arithmetic that makes betrayal obvious to the world. They had assumed my absence was a tomb. They had misread the shape of my return. I smiled once, without joy, at the moonlight through the bare window, and felt the shift. The household that had been ready to bury me had instead set the stage for my reckoning. The silence had taught me one final thing. When the world believes you are finished, the whisper of a plan becomes thunder if you only wait and know where to strike with truth. I began to treat memory like currency, and the first step was to audit the theft. In the rooms they had emptied, I found whispers tucked inside seams, receipts shoved behind picture frames, a sticky note folded into the spine of a book, a stray email printed and left in haste. Each scrap was a breadcrumb on the path they'd thought would vanish with my breath. I followed them with quiet obsession because Notary whose hands moved with the ease of someone who had sealed destinies, a nurse at the clinic who kept records like liturgies, an archivist at the county clerk's office who treated ledgers as holy texts. They were small, practical guardians of order, and they taught me how to make systems serve justice rather than convenience. We built a lattice of proof, certified copies of strange withdrawals, witness statements from neighbors who had been coached into silence, timestamps on messages that betrayed rehearsed performance. Each piece of paper was a tile in a mosaic that showed intent rather than accident. I learned how to frame questions so that a clerk volunteered details, how to ask for transaction histories in language that resisted obfuscation, how to demand notarization that turned casual lies into formal impossibilities. Alone, I might have been a wounded old man shaking a fist at the void. With them, I became an engineer of consequence. They taught me patience, the slow alchemy that turns suspicion into proof. Some nights we worked like conspirators of law, drafting letters that would arrive at precise times, arranging for certified mail to catch them off guard with the sudden gravity of formality. The act of bureaucracy became tiny acts of ritual, a stamp here, a signature there, and each ritual tightened the net. I also learned to use silence as reconnaissance. By not responding to their provocations, I let them reveal their patterns under the false comfort of assumed dominance. When Glenn recorded me, the files found their way into evidence because I had a recorder of my own. When neighbors were asked to sign statements, they discovered that the truth is lighter to carry than the burden of appeasement. In quiet meetings over coffee and in late-night phone calls, my counsel taught me to build a narrative that would survive interrogation, chronology anchored in receipts, motive shown by prior transactions, a pattern of incremental theft framed against documented caregiving claims. We did not seek spectacle. Spectacle feeds mobs and emotions, not judges. We prepared documents with the kind of austerity that embarrasses lies, because lies unravel fastest when faced with steady protocol. Outside, my daughter and her husband practiced normalcy, the costume of civility. Inside, the lattice closed. Each certified letter, each witness affidavit, each appointment with a specialist was a small, inexorable tightening. They had mistaken my surgery for an end. Instead, it had been a hinge. The hinge swung slowly, and in the quiet work of the counsel, quiet warriors who respect procedure over drama, I discovered a truth more dangerous than rage, that order, when wielded with precision, unmasks betrayal in a way that leaves no place for pleading. There comes a moment in every campaign of truth when the hunter must study his prey, not with contempt, but with understanding. I stood before the mirror in the hallway, the one she had left behind because it was too heavy to move, and saw the man they had underestimated. My face had thinned, yes, and the scar along my collarbone caught the light like punctuation at the end of an unfinished sentence. But the eyes were steady now, unblinking. In their reflection, I rehearsed the conversation that would one day arrive, not a confrontation, but a mirror held up to the architecture of deceit. To confront someone properly, you must know what story they tell themselves at night. So I listened to them remotely, legally, through the public channels of their own making. Social posts, bank statements, overheard conversations that slipped through friendly ears. Every fragment revealed the myth they were building, the devoted daughter, the selfless caregiver, the misunderstood heir keeping a house afloat while her father drifted in confusion. I let them have their myth. I even fed it, once or twice, with polite messages and carefully crafted gratitude. Because belief is the easiest chain to forge. When they believed I had forgiven, their guard dissolved. But as I watched, I learned something disquieting. Deceit does not come from malice alone. It is often born from the cowardice of convenience. My daughter had not set out to betray. She had grown comfortable in the soft corruption of small lies, each one cushioning her from consequence. Glenn, though, wore his deceit like armor. He was efficient, meticulous, the kind of man who mistakes manipulation for intellect. He had turned empathy into an algorithm: find weakness, exploit, rationalize, repeat. I catalogued each behavior, not to mimic it, but to understand the rhythm of their confidence. Because revenge built on rage is blind, but revenge built on comprehension is orchestral. The mirror taught me posture, the reflection taught me restraint. Each morning I practiced calmness the way a swordsman practices stillness before the strike. When you face your betrayers, fury must never reach your eyes. It must remain in the bloodstream, quiet as static, ready to power precision. I began to speak slower, to move with deliberate grace, to inhabit patients so completely that it unnerved them when we met in passing. "You look well, Dad," she said once, her voice a careful mixture of concern and guilt. "Better than I expected." I smiled and replied, "Expectation has always been your weakness." She laughed, but her eyes flickered. The briefest acknowledgement that she felt the mirror turning. After that, they started locking their phones. They stopped discussing certain accounts in the open. Fear had entered their story like a draft through a cracked window. I didn't need to confront them yet. The echo was doing the work for me. In that echo, I saw the first tremor of understanding. They had resurrected a man they could no longer predict. And that, I realized, was the most exquisite form of justice, to become the silence they cannot read. Revenge, I learned, doesn't live in noise, it breathes in intervals of quiet precision. I began structuring my days as though they were blueprints, each hour a line drawn toward equilibrium. Morning began with the deliberate ritual of order, coffee measured by weight, paper stacked by relevance, phone calls logged in tidy handwriting. The repetition made me invisible again, which was the point. Predictability is camouflage. While they performed their theater of normal life, I built foundations underneath their stage. My lawyer and I refined filings with the discipline of clockmakers, every clause aligned, every date cross-referenced. Emotion had no place here. It contaminates evidence. When the phone rang, I let it ring twice before answering. Timing is a language. I spoke in steady tones, never arguing, always confirming. Each of course or thank you became a tool to make others underestimate the depth of what I already knew. Their arrogance depended on my perceived confusion. I let that myth stand. In the afternoons I walked the perimeter of the property, noting small things, tire marks near the curb, a receipt drifting from a garbage bin, the faint scent of Glenn's cologne clinging to the porch where he claimed he never stood. Observation became meditation. I wrote nothing until evening, when the sun turned everything to amber and the house fell into its long exhale. Then I chronicled the day as data, never anger, only facts. The more meticulous I became, the calmer I felt. Calmness is contagious, but it also unnerves the guilty. They mistake it for ignorance. When my daughter visited one afternoon, she lingered too long at the doorway, scanning the room as if checking for missing evidence of her own invention. "You've been busy," she said, trying for warmth but landing on unease. I smiled. "Order is a kind of therapy," I replied. She nodded, her eyes flickering to the empty shelves where her guilt once hid. "Good," she murmured. "You need that." What she didn't understand was that therapy and preparation are often twins. The more tranquil my presence became, the more erratic theirs grew. They sent texts with awkward pauses, called at odd hours to check in, asked leading questions about my health. I answered with kindness, deliberate, polished kindness, each word a mirror forcing them to see their reflection. The documents were nearly ready, the witnesses quietly aligned, the appointments scheduled with the precision of dominoes before a single touch. That night, as rain whispered against the windows, I sat again before the heavy mirror. My reflection looked less like vengeance now, and more like balance returning to a tilted world. Calm isn't surrender, it's readiness. And as I stared into my own steady eyes, I understood. The moment they think you have forgiven them is the moment they hand you their unguarded truth. The architecture was complete. All that remained was the quiet patience to let gravity do its work. Truth doesn't rush, it descends. Slow, inevitable, deliberate, like dusk crawling across a field. The filings were in motion now, quiet as seeds beneath soil. My lawyer called it due process. I called it gravity. Every act of deceit they had crafted now carried its own weight, pulling them gently toward exposure. All I had to do was step aside and let nature obey its mathematics. The days unfolded with unnerving calm. I no longer watched the clock, I watched their confidence decay in increments. Glenn's voice, once firm and calculated, began to carry tremors of over-explanation. My daughter's laughter, once bright and rehearsed, now faltered between syllables. It is strange how guilt changes the air. A room thickens, eye contact shortens, even silence sounds louder. I didn't need confrontation. I became a mirror large enough for them to see themselves falling. I visited the notary again, signed where I was told, each stroke of my pen an incision in their illusion. "You're remarkably composed," the notary said. "Most people come in trembling." I smiled. "Trembling," I replied, "is for those who fear the truth." Outside, autumn had begun to turn the trees to copper, fitting perhaps that the world mirrored the slow burn of reckoning. The evidence now had a pulse of its own, bank records aligned with timestamps, a neighbor's testimony corroborated inconsistencies they thought invisible. Even their kindness had become documentation, the carefully timed visits, the purchased sympathy cards, the digital trail of performative guilt. They were architects of their own undoing. I merely archived the blueprints. That evening, I brewed tea and let the steam drift toward the ceiling. I no longer rehearsed revenge, I observed consequences. There's a difference. Revenge demands participation, but consequences, they arrive uninvited, steady as rain. I found peace in that distinction. When she called later that night, her voice trembled. "Dad," she whispered, "someone from the bank called. They're reviewing the transactions. Did you—" I let the pause stretch, let the silence breathe meaning into her fear. "I only asked for clarity," I said softly. "Clarity isn't an accusation." The line went quiet, a heartbeat, then another. I could almost hear the ledger in her mind, the rapid audit of everything she thought hidden. "I didn't mean," she began. "I know," I interrupted gently. "None of us ever mean to until the truth lands." We hung up in that suspended quiet, her confusion blooming into panic, my serenity deepening into closure. The house felt lighter, almost forgiving. Gravity had begun its patient descent, and for the first time since the hospital I slept without dreaming. There's a moment when a lie begins to decay, not with noise, but with the faint scent of something that can no longer stay hidden. I noticed it first in their speech. Words that used to glide now stumbled over one another. "Just a misunderstanding," Glenn said one afternoon, his smile stretched too thin to be convincing. "We were only trying to help." Hell. P. The word tasted strange now, metallic and hollow. I watched him avoid my eyes while pretending to straighten the mail I had already organized. In the faint tremor of his hands, I saw the architecture of certainty collapsing brick by brick. By then, the documents had started to speak for themselves. The court clerk stamped. Acknowledgments, the letters from the bank, the polite follow-ups from auditors, they formed a choir of quiet inevitability. Each official envelope that arrived at their door carried the same message: "We see you now. No accusation, just illumination. That's how truth works. It doesn't shout, it exposes." My lawyer called with updates that sounded almost casual. "They're requesting clarification on the transfers," he said. "Nothing aggressive yet, but the pattern's clear." I thanked him, then watched the sun drift across the floorboards like a slow spotlight. Somewhere, far from this calm room, the myth of their innocence was fraying. My daughter tried to reach me more often. Each conversation was wrapped in the same artificial warmth, like fabric stretched over splinters. "Dad, we should talk. People are getting the wrong idea," she said. "You've always been fair." Fairness, I thought, is what people beg for when balance finally arrives. I listened, said little, and let the silence expand until her voice cracked under its own weight. Guilt doesn't need an audience. It only needs time. At night, the house felt different. Lighter in some rooms, heavier in others. The spaces she had emptied no longer echoed with loss, they hummed with return. I began restoring small things, an old photograph placed back on the mantel, a chair retrieved from storage, a book I once loved reopened to its final chapter. Each object reclaimed was a note in a requiem for pretense. When sleep came, it brought no vengeance, only comprehension. The unraveling wasn't punishment, it was gravity finishing its descent. They had built their comfort on borrowed foundations, and the earth was finally remembering what belonged where. I didn't need to move another piece. The design was complete, and the structure of lies was now dismantling itself. Quietly, beautifully, as all truths eventually do. It was a Wednesday when they came, unannounced, uninvited, and visibly rehearsed. I heard the car before I saw it, the nervous rhythm of a poorly idling engine lingering at the curb. When the knock arrived, it wasn't bold. It was the kind of knock guilt makes, polite, uneven, as if asking permission to exist. I opened the door slowly, and there they were, my daughter clutching a casserole dish like an offering, Glenn behind her, trying to manufacture confidence out of posture. "Dad," she began too brightly, "we thought we'd stop by. You haven't been answering." I stepped aside. "I answer when there's something worth hearing," I said. It wasn't anger, just truth, spoken without ornament. They entered anyway, their eyes scanning the house as if searching for evidence of their own undoing. The silence between us was a third guest, invisible yet impossible to ignore. She placed the dish on the counter, her movements careful, deliberate. "You've redecorated," she said, noting the returned chair, the restored photographs. "I've restored," I corrected. Decoration is for the living. Restoration is for the forgotten. Glenn chuckled, brittle as dry leaves. We're family, he said. No need for all this tension. I turned toward him. Tension, I replied, is what happens when gravity starts to work on those who've tried to float above consequence. The words landed between us like quiet thunder. He shifted, then tried to steer the moment toward small talk, but the air refused to cooperate. My daughter's smile began to tremble at the edges. Dad, people are talking, she said finally. The lawyers, the bank, they think there's been a misunderstanding. We should clear it up. Misunderstanding, I repeated softly, as if testing the word. That's an interesting term for deliberate subtraction. Her breath hitched. Glenn glanced at her, but she didn't look back. I saw the shape of realization pass over her face. The understanding that the narrative she'd built was collapsing in slow motion. I don't hate you, I said after a long pause, but I can't save you from gravity. The room was still. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock, patient as ever. They stood in that quiet, realizing for the first time that no apology could rewrite records or silence proof. Then, as if guided by instinct, they turned to leave. My daughter lingered at the door, her voice small, almost childlike. You really won't forgive me? I looked past her toward the gray horizon outside. Forgiveness is irrelevant, I said. What matters is that the truth has finally come home. When the door closed behind them, the air felt lighter, not from victory, but from release. Outside, the wind carried away the last echo of pretense. Inside, I poured tea, sat by the window, and watched the evening fade. The visit hadn't been reconciliation. It had been confirmation, that some reckonings don't arrive with anger, but with silence that refuses to lie anymore. After they left, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The walls no longer carried the echoes of betrayal. They absorbed peace instead, slow, deliberate, patient. The house had changed tone entirely. It no longer mourned what was taken. It breathed in what had been reclaimed. Every room whispered its own form of closure. The chair by the window, the photograph restored to its frame, even the quiet hum of the refrigerator, all of it pulsed with quiet defiance. In the days that followed, I noticed the small miracles of stillness. Mornings came softer. The air no longer trembled with tension. I tended to my garden again, the one she'd once said was a waste of space. I found weeds where flowers used to be, but even that felt poetic. I kneeled, dug my hands into the earth, and began pulling away what didn't belong. For the first time, I realized this was never about revenge. It was about reclamation, about reminding the world and myself that what's taken unjustly will always find its way back, one truth at a time. People in town started asking questions. The story had spread, not through gossip, but through consequence. Accounts frozen, assets reviewed, their names appearing in documents they never thought would surface. The universe, it seemed, had decided to balance the books. I didn't need to intervene anymore. Gravity had completed its course. Then one evening, as the last of the sun's light painted the walls in gold, I found her letter, slipped beneath the door. No envelope, no address, just my name, written in the shaky hand of someone who had run out of excuses. I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know what I was trying to prove. I see it now, all of it. You were never supposed to come back, and that's what terrified me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll let the anger rest. I folded the letter carefully and set it beside my cup of tea. Forgiveness, maybe not yet. But peace, yes. Peace had already moved in. That night, I sat by the window as the wind passed through the garden, stirring the new seedlings. I thought about everything that had fallen away and everything that had grown in its place. The house, once a grave of memories, had become a witness to renewal. The lights flickered softly. The world outside felt distant but kind. And in that gentle quiet, I realized something final. I had not lost a daughter. I had found myself again. The story had begun in betrayal. It ended in balance. And between those two truths, I rediscovered the most powerful form of revenge there is, peace that needs no audience.